a lot of things that we've added. And so I highly recommend that. We've added new buildings like the George Washington Library and this orientation center, and also a new museum. So, these buildings just go on forever, and it's fascinating to read all about George Washington and see all of the things that he did. I'm Beverly Addington, and I'm Director of Product Licensing at Mount Vernon. And I have the best job here because because I get to go behind the scenes, and I got to see firsthand George Washington's white kid inaugural gloves and Martha Washington's purple silk shoes, her wedding shoes. And when you do something like that, it's so meaningful to you. How many people get to see all the things that I get to? So that's why I think it's the best job. And it's really interesting, too, when I came to Mount Vernon, I came down here the day before I had my interview, and I walked back into the 18th century, literally. I was just amazed at what this place does. And Mount Vernon has always tried to keep the place the way it was the year that Washington died in 1799. And it just brags accuracy and everything else. And from a girl who grew up in Dallas, Texas, where the only historic building was the old Dr. Pepper plant, it was quite an interesting education for me. We started 24 years ago with a licensing program. The board voted on it. They did all these research, and then I came to the organization. I've had a wonderful time. The licensing department is another way to expand the knowledge of George Washington and also to make additional income. And the income that are made off of these licensing programs goes directly to the Preservation and Conservation Fund, not to operational money at all. So that really makes me feel really good that I can give back in that way. I'd like to introduce you to the staff from Harden that's here. I think Beth Penley is still out there. She's a wonderful, Beth, just step in and wave at everybody. Beth Penley is Vice President of Design at Harden, an interior designer, and does a wonderful job. And if you get a chance, you need some questions asked, she's the one to do it. Also, we have Deborah Sams, which was at the front desk. She is our sales rep for Harden at Mount Vernon. There's Deborah is, and Deborah has really pulled so much of this together. It wouldn't be possible without her. Thank you, Deborah. Also, we have Arlene Hall, Director of Marketing. Where is Arlene? Right back there. And Arlene Hall, she does everything. She really does. She's a great gal to have. And then we have Greg's wife, Lori Harden. Put your hand up. She's the Principal of Design and Resources for Harden. And please feel free to get to know all of these people. Now, we have two really good speakers today. One is Greg Harden, CEO and President of Harden. And then we have a Mount Vernon licensee. And then we have our own Associate Curator, Adam Erby, who's going to talk about George Washington and innovation. This has been a natural fit with Harden. The history of our two fine companies really coincide. Mount Vernon Ladies Association was formed in 1853, and they purchased Mount Vernon in 1858. And now they operate completely exclusively without any government funding. And then you have Harden, which is the oldest manufacturing company of residential and commercial furnishings in North America, and Greg Harden, as the CEO and president, is also the fifth generation of his family to head this fine furniture company, something that you just don't hear of anymore. Harden was at the forefront of environmental conservation long before its industry's peers. Harden's manufacturing process begins with sustainable forestry, and the company's procurement operations are certified by the Sustainable Forestry Initiative program. At Mount Vernon, George Washington practiced sustainability. In March 1786, Washington writes, and I quote, "Nothing in my opinion would contribute more to the welfare of these states than the proper management of our lands, and nothing in this state particularly seems to be less understood. The present mode of cropping practiced among us is destructive to landed property and must, if persisted in much longer, ultimately ruin the holders of it." And those are prophetic words. Those are things we're still discussing. So I'm going to introduce Greg Harden. He's Director of Sustainable Furnishings Council. He's Director of New York Design Center. He's Chairman of the Board of Trustees at the Tri-Valley Y and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the New York Ski Educational Foundation. In his spare time, I don't know that he ever has any, but I can't think of anyone more qualified to discuss sustainability as he.
Beverly was, for the most part, truthful in that introduction. She did, however, say you had 2 qualified speakers today. Adam's the only one here who really is going to be a good speaker, a good qualified speaker today. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I've got to thank Beverly. Beverly and I think, first met maybe 4 years ago, give or take 6 months, and we discussed the Mount Vernon license, and the discussions went on for a good period of time. And I will tell you that I've never met a nicer bunch of people in my life than the folks at Mount Vernon. They're absolutely wonderful, and we're really proud to be a licensee, I guess, of Mount Vernon. So Beverly, thank you very much. And welcome everybody. I know it's a little bit chilly out there today. Harden Furniture is located a little bit north of Syracuse, New York, and if you're watching the Weather Channel this morning, they're talking about Oswego in Mexico and 36 inches, 37 inches of snow, and that's where we are. So I'm kind of glad to be down here. It's a little chilly out there. I'm sure that probably when George Washington left the presidency and retired to Mount Vernon, probably this time of the year he was in Palm Beach. I'm sure it's a very popular place at the time. But I'll talk a little bit about sustainability. I'll jump around a little bit because, in all honesty, there are some things in the PowerPoint presentation that a couple of years after it was put together really aren't either relevant or accurate anymore. And I'll skip over the product part of it a little bit because we're here really to think about Mount Vernon a little bit more and maybe a little bit less about Harden. Although when you do go out into the foyer afterwards, there's a nice display of Harden product just across the way. I also, Debbie Sams asked me to remind everybody here that if you're here for the CEUs, or the CEU, you have to fill out your paperwork after the presentation. I think I got that right. But a little bit about Harden. We were founded in 1844, and we're the oldest family-owned manufacturer of residential and commercial furnishings in North America, Canada and America combined. And we're very proud of that. We've been located in McConnellsville, New York for that entire 172-year period. And when we think about sustainability, sometimes we say we were sustainable before sustainable was cool. But in all honesty, growing up in that community, being part of that area, we have a very different appreciation for the environment than probably a lot of other manufacturers would or other residents would. It's our home. It's not just a place where we happen to have a furniture factory. A couple of things about sustainable design. For one thing, it doesn't have to be rustic. It doesn't have to be named. It doesn't have to be categorized. It doesn't have to be defined. And very often, and particularly with the Mount Vernon product, we try to create products that really aren't easy to define. They can work in a lot of different environments. And it's really the other thing that's a little bit awkward about today is I'm talking about design to folks who are far more qualified in design than I am. So please bear with me. It can be elegant. It can be transitional, it can be traditional, it can be formal, it can be casual. There are a lot of different ways that products can work. A couple of things about sustainability, and perhaps the first one the first point there is that the majority of consumers support sustainability. The frustrating thing is when they get to the point of sale, very often they don't want to pay for it. But one of the interesting points is that a company like Harden that is manufacturing using sustainable practices, our cost to manufacture are lower than a lot of our competitors who don't. It's very expensive to move furniture and materials for thousands of miles over oceans. It's very expensive to package them in cardboard and plastic and then carton them again. That's all very expensive and not very sustainable. And one other thing about Harden, which really reduces our cost of operation, is, as I mentioned, we're in upstate New York. We're north of Syracuse. I think the average temperature last February for the month was 2 degrees. We don't use any fossil fuels to heat our facility. It's all done using wood waste. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But they do mention here that there are consumers who will pay a little bit more for sustainability, however, not a whole lot. We mentioned LEED certification and a preference for LEED for green furnishings. I really wish that that the folks at LEED would give solid wood a little bit more of an opportunity to qualify for LEED points. And I've got an extra slide I'll show you at the end if they can cue it up that talks a little bit about the advantage of wood in the LEED standard. My son Max is here with us today, and he's a recent graduate of, he's got his master's degree in architecture, so I should probably have him telling me about LEED because he's a lot more knowledgeable about it than I am. Sustainable Forestry Initiative. It's actually headquartered here in Washington. Great organization. Originally began as part of the American Pulp and Paper Association, but for a number of years it's been completely independent, and it has its own independent board, and really is a wonderful standard. A lot of you are familiar with Forest Stewardship Council. SFI and FSC really are very similar. I would say almost identical. Harden Furniture, we're the only furniture manufacturer today in North America other than Ethan Allen who operates a sawmill in addition to manufacturing furniture. So if you come to McConnellsville, New York to see us, and you're all very welcome, you're all invited, you'll get to see it start as a log and end up as a final piece of furniture, with every step in between being performed at Harden. But we became part of SFI about 12 years ago, I believe. Went through our initial audit. We've been audited annually since, and we were just recently audited to the new standard. Comparing SFI to FSC, FSC is a little bit more rigorous when it comes to international issues like illegal logging, social equity issues. Whereas Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI, we feel that on the ground in North America is actually a better standard. We don't clear cut. We don't use herbicides. We're very careful in how we manage our properties. And in all honesty, with a hardwood forest, you would be foolish not to manage it in a sustainable manner. One of the nice things about coming to Mount Vernon is you drive in here from any direction, you see beautiful stands of hardwood. I did not bring a chainsaw. I wish I had. There are some key steps to certification for SFI. One is soil quality. We have to maintain the soil quality on the tracts that we harvest. That means not driving through it with skidders and machinery and tearing it up. It means making sure that you're leaving enough material after you've harvested that the soil can regenerate. I think oftentimes people take soil for granted. They tend to think that, you know, here's the grass, and for 200 feet there's soil. In all honesty, there's only soil for a couple of feet, and that's absolutely critical to the health of the forest. Groundwater preservation. As I said, when we work in the forest, we don't want to make a lot of ruts or tracks. We're very careful. We have to be in how we cross little streams. We have a number of portable bridges that we will haul in and out of logging projects so that we're not dragging things and driving through streams and compromising groundwater quality. Habitat management really goes without saying. We have to be very careful that we don't disturb wildlife habitat. Erosion control, it gets back to that whole groundwater, stream crossing. One interesting thing is that this winter in upstate New York, it's probably been the best winter for logging we've had in years. We don't have a ton of snow. I know we define ton of snow a little bit differently, but in our case, if the snow is 6 feet deep, it's tough for loggers to get around in the woods. This year we've only got 2 or 3 feet of snow on the ground, which is quite easy for them to get around. And it's been cold enough that the ground is frozen, not too cold that they can't get equipment started and can't work comfortably. Very often, when we're working on a particular property, we have to harvest in the winter because that property owner either requires it, or in some cases we have to wait until the ground is frozen so that we can get around in the woods without causing a lot of the issues you see above. Reforestation, we have to take very close measurements on what's regrowing, because regrowth is vitally important to the entire health of that ecosystem. We measure it carefully, we encourage it, and if we're doing the kind of harvesting that we're required to do, you're only taking maybe 10 or 20% of the mature timber off that parcel, off that stand of timber. And you open up some holes in the canopy, light comes down, the seedlings and the smaller trees on the forest floor then have a chance to grow. Minimizing effects from operations, I mentioned that earlier. Tree species management. We like to manage in 2 ways. We try to look at the mix of species on a property. We try to look at the age on a property. We like uneven age stands. We always manage to uneven age. So you've got a mix of very young and very mature trees. We only harvest the trees that are mature enough that if we were to come back in 10 or 20 years to harvest again, those trees probably would have rotted or they would have fallen. Clear cutting, it's only allowed in very specific situations within SFI and FSC. We don't do any clear cutting. Chain of custody. Chain of custody is important because very often we will have to certify to somebody that the product that they are purchasing from us is certified to the SFI standard. And distance travel from location to manufacture. With Sustainable Furnishings Council as well as SFI, we have a 500-mile, I wouldn't call it a rule, but a 500-mile preference. We try to source product as close as we can to the point of manufacture. As a society, we consume a ton of fuel, moving things across the oceans, across countries. The more we can keep it local, the better it is for the environment. Here's just a pretty photo, but it also shows a little bit about natural need regeneration. You've got openings in the canopy, you've got some mature timber, you've got some less mature timber, and if you can look down in the foreground, you've actually got some seedlings. You have a lot of ferns in this property. Ferns are not good for regeneration. A heavy deer population is very bad for regeneration too. They really tend to depress the maple population because they love little maple seedlings and saplings. I was mentioning a little bit about that 500-mile rule and carbon footprint. We publish on our website our carbon report every year. And our goal has been to reduce our carbon emissions annually, and our carbon emissions are much lower than they were a number of years ago, and we've still got some room to go. But again, I mentioned ocean-going shipping. I believe that 6% of the fossil fuels consumed in the world today are by ocean-going vessels. So all that trade is good for economies, but unfortunately in a lot of cases it's creating a lot of the greenhouse gas issues that we see in the world today. A little bit about Harden. Over on the right you'll see an aerial photo of Harden Furniture in McConnellsville. We're probably a company that most people would think is 1/10 the size of that. But we've got a pretty good sized facility. We've got 225 really qualified craftsmen and craftswomen. Interesting that I'm here in Washington because we do quite a bit of work here with the federal government as well. The conference table in the Roosevelt Room of the White House where the President meets with his cabinet is a Harden table. And most of the furnishings now in the White House and the Executive Office building are Harden. Pretty much every office in either one of those 2 facilities are Harden. You've all been to the Capitol Visitors Bureau. You've probably all been through the Capitol and those kind of things. But if you're sitting in a stacking chair, either at the visitor center or in the caucus rooms, that's the Harden Crossroads chair. We talked a little bit about waste wood and chips. At one point, we actually were generating power at our facility because we had enough excess material that we could fire a boiler and use high-pressure steam. The generation of power is not as easy as we thought it was 30 years ago, so we're no longer a power generator. But we do make great use of byproducts of our sawmill operation. It could be, you'll notice here that these logs have been debarked. We remove the bark prior to the head saw because it contains generally a lot of dirt from being handled and moved in the log yard and moved in the field. That bark falls down, gets mixed with other byproducts, and it goes over to the silos where we store our fuel for the boilers, and that heats our facility. We very often will sell chips to third parties, and we also, our sawdust, we collect separately, and we sell that to farmers. They use it for bedding for dairy cattle. Sustainable Furnishings Council, Rick Fedrizzi, who's originally from Syracuse, is in Washington now, is head of the USGBC, and Mike Italiano. Mike also is originally from Syracuse, and he was the co-founder of the United States Green Building Council. Mike's now an environmental attorney, works mainly out of Washington, but those two guys both went to the state of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. Great guys, know them both well. And Mike was one of the co-founders of SFC, and SFC will celebrate its 10th anniversary this coming October market, not April, but October. The October High Point Market will celebrate our 10th anniversary. In 2008, Harden became the first company in SFC to be certified as exemplary. And we remain silver exemplary to this day. A little bit about criteria with Sustainable Furnishings Council. And by the way, if you go to the Sustainable Furnishings Council website, as interior designers, we'd love to have a lot of you folks become members. It's not expensive. It's a great organization. But again, we work to eliminate unrecyclable content, primary materials, and in generally speaking, anything we put into our product, we want to make sure that that raw material or that input has got the smallest environmental footprint possible. Utilize life cycle assessment. It's very important as we look at our products. What is the impact of that product? One good thing about furniture is that we use solid wood almost exclusively. We use very little veneer, only where we need it for decorative purposes. We don't use much metal. We don't use a lot of glass. And I'll show you a slide in a little bit if the guys can cue it up. But when you look at the impact of wood when it's used as a building material or it's used in furniture, it actually sequesters carbon. It takes carbon out of the environment. So we are a net sequesterer of carbon in our operations. I also mentioned a little bit about burning of waste material to heat the factory. To the extent that those waste materials come off sustainable parcels of land or forest, it's carbon neutral because the carbon that we emit when we burn those gets taken up by new growth on the forest floor. And supporting the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. I think everybody's familiar with that. It's one of those key concepts of any sustainability program. The American Home Furnishings Alliance and Sustainable Furnishings Council both operate standards. I won't go into any great detail here, but again, they're both very effective. They're both having an impact, and one of the things we'd love to see is for consumers to pay a little bit more attention to that. A few things on indoor air quality. I think California Prop 65 and CARB standards. In fact, the Consumer Product Safety Council just announced that they were going to be the only arbiter of CARB standard. The California Air Resource Board said they were going to be the only arbiters of the CARB standard, which is very good news. But with CARB and Prop 65, CARB specifically for the furniture industry pertains to the amount of formaldehyde that can be in any kind of product. And in the furniture industry, in solid wood, you don't have any formaldehyde. We use formaldehyde-free glues. In a lot of veneers, or where you've got any kind of a particle board or manufactured product, laminate, those glues used to have a lot of formaldehyde in them. And that gets delivered to someone's home, and the first day it's there, it's emitting formaldehyde. And a year later, it's emitting formaldehyde. And 10 years later, that's emitting formaldehyde. And obviously, you don't want anything in your home that's used for embalming fluid. The two really go counter unless you're a funeral home. But we're completely compliant with CARB. The little bit of veneered or a little bit of laminate that we might use for things is completely CARB compliant. ANSI BIFMA also has standards for formaldehyde, although CARBs are the most stringent in the country, and total volatile organic compound emissions as well. We use nothing but high solids lacquers. Most of our finishing materials are water-based, and on request, we can do anything in a water-based lacquer. Reduction and elimination of chemicals of concern. ANSI BIFMA published a list of about 800 chemicals of concern. At that time, when we certified to the ANSI BIFMA standard, we had 5 of those chemicals in our processes. All those chemicals have been removed from our processes. Most of them are used in our maintenance facility, in our maintenance operations. And as I mentioned, water-based lacquers. Water-based lacquers have not gotten to the point yet where they are as clear and deep and beautiful as a pre-cat or a nitrocellulose lacquer, but they're getting better. And as I mentioned before, we can use them if required. They work better on lighter finishes than they do on dark because they tend to have a little bit of a bluish-gray haze. Prop 65, I won't go into any great detail on this. It's a lot of text, but Prop 65 is a California regulation that says if you have present in your product, if you have present in your public place anything that could possibly be carcinogenic, you have to have a Prop 65 warning. When you're walking down the jet bridge at the airport, there's a Prop 65 warning in California. When you walk into a restaurant, there's a Prop 65 warning. We do label our products, but we don't have anything that is a Prop 65 concern for Harden Furniture. Here are the warning labels. Again, this is more if we're talking to an industry group. Flame retardants. This is the, I'll choose my words carefully. I won't be unscripted like Donald Trump. I'll try to be a little bit more civil. Sometimes regulations work at cross purposes. Sometimes the intent is great and the execution is terrible. And that's really the case to a degree with TB 117. The new 2015 standard is a step in the right direction. But urethane foams today have flame retardants in them. And there are several flame retardants. The worst ones now are out of foams. They're not allowed anymore. The next level, which also can be harmful, can be toxic. We don't have in our foams, but some people do have them in their foams. We still have a couple in our foams that we use, but again, they're the non-toxic variety, and they're minimal. But TB 117 says we don't want your upholstered furniture to create a devastating fire in your home. Well, number one, furniture rarely starts the fire. The tobacco industry is much more responsible for sofas and beds burning than the furniture industry, but they're a little more better funded than we are. So they can lobby a little more effectively. So the standard tends to fall back on furniture. So the industry has put all of these flame retardants into foams that you're sitting on, that your kids are sleeping on, that probably all of us once in a while lie down on that sofa. It also, if you have a regular mattress that you sleep on, you've got the same flame retardant chemicals in the mattress, maybe even in a pillow. But what we have argued is that we would like to see the flame retardants come out of the foams. We'd like to have a different standard introduced that might not be quite as safe from a flammability standpoint, but is safer in the long run for the consumer. The 2015 standard goes a little bit in that direction. It puts more of the burden on the fabric, and it's replaced the open flame test with a smolder test, which more realistically represents how a fire might start in someone's home, and that's typically a cigarette in a sofa or on a bed. If you have a fire in your kitchen and your house is fully engulfed in flames, your sofa is going to burn regardless. But we just don't want to see the product starting the fire, nor does California, nor does the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So TB 117, the 2015 standard, is really a step in the right direction. I mentioned new testing standards, fabric versus foam and flammability, and really the national implications. We're expecting TB 117 or something like it to become a national standard. We'd really like to see that happen. We just hope that the standard is designed so we don't have to go to a barrier. A lot of you do commercial work would understand that. For Boston Fire Code and TB 133, you really have to use a Sandel barrier around your cushions and any place where there might be foam in the product, because that's a flame-proof barrier. I've got California 133 and Boston Fire Code. I won't read through this. If anybody really wants me to read through it, just wave your hand and great. No hands. If I got a couple hands, we go to majority vote. A little bit about Harden, and I mentioned construction earlier. We use pretty much all bench-built construction. We offer a cushion that we call Eco 1. We do sell it a little bit to people who have extreme chemical allergies, and we use natural jute for springs. All of our springing is recycled steel. We use an all-natural latex in the cushion. We use pileated wool. We use organic cottons. We even use an organic burlap. And if the finish that we use would be just a boiled linseed oil. So we can do a pure 100% certified organic piece of upholstery for folks, and once in a while we get that request. As I mentioned before, natural materials. Beth Penley, who's here today, who was announced earlier, who Beverly introduced. Beth oversees our fabric buying and design, and she tries to look for materials that are organic cottons, which are not easy to find. The other problem with organic cottons is that cottons are the material that has the toughest time passing that smolder test for TB 117, another one of those cross purposes. But Beth and our fabric team do a great job in selecting great covers, but also ones that environmentally are pretty friendly. A little bit about wood. As I mentioned, we do mainly solid wood. We use almost all solid cherry. We use a little bit of maple in some collections. We use a little bit of oak. In our live edge table program, we use some solid walnut and also solid curly maple as well. But most of what you see from Harden will be solid, and occasionally we'll use a veneer just for decorative purposes. Again, sustainably manufactured is something we take a lot of pride in. We really hold ourselves to a pretty high standard, and one of the things we try to do is continuously improve our performance environmentally. Anybody have any questions? Great. I'll be around at the reception later. Oh.
One question. You were talking about your forests. Are they owned by you or leased from you?
The company owned 10,000 acres of forest property for a long time, and those were spun off to the family a number of years ago. And we still own some forest property. I own some personally, but even when we own 10,000 acres of property, we were only getting 15% of our material from those properties. So we're buying logs from probably 50 or 60 different vendors at any given time. Some are independent loggers who Beverly might own 200 acres of timber property somewhere and have a nice vacation home on it or a cabin in the woods on it, and she might work with a consulting forester, harvest it, and we would purchase the timber. A lot of the timber we buy, New York State has a lot of state forests near us, and they harvest those on a regular basis, so we'll bid that timber. And very often it'll simply be what we call gatewood, which is an independent logger working somewhere, and he brings logs in for us.
This may be an inappropriate question, but I'm very curious about something that was much in the news a few years ago, and that is the hybridized chestnut trees.
Mm-hmm.
That there was some, because I had some friends that had some beautiful
Yep.
paneling back many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That was chestnut.
Yep.
Are you aware of anything that's happening with the chestnut trees that are resistant to the disease?
The American Chestnut Program, actually this ESF in Syracuse, College of Environmental Science and Forestry, they've been very active in the American Chestnut Program. And they are working to hybridize a chestnut tree that will be resistant to the fungus that killed them all, I think about 100 years ago. At one time, the chestnut tree was the most populous tree in the northeastern part of the United States. You can still find some chestnut, but it's all big beams and old warehouses. It was very popular for that because it had a lot of oil in it and was very resistant to rot. But today, there are no chestnut trees, save a couple of oddballs that managed to survive over the years. But they are working to hybridize and find a chestnut that can be reintroduced and repopulated. Anything else? Yeah, there's a slide, guys, the IT guys back there. You'll see on that flash drive a slide that says carbon slide. Can you pull that up? I don't know. That's okay. Adam, why don't you go ahead, and if I can get it up later, I will. Thank you. Do you have a...
Yeah, mine's...
They're going to cue yours up? Okay.
Yeah.
Very good, Greg. Thank you so much. Very interesting. The next speaker is our Associate Curator, Adam Erby, and he has analyzed many a conundrum when it comes to investigating the original furnishings of George Washington, and he's done some remarkable things. Adam was responsible for the newest refurbishment, restoration of the large dining room, which Washington called his new room, because it was the last room he built onto the house. And in doing so, Adam found some remarkable information that has just, transformed that room. So if you're going on the tour, you'll see what everybody has done. It's absolutely beautiful. Adam has also a BA from University of Virginia, and from Winter, he has a MA in American Material Culture. Please welcome Adam Erby.
Thank you, Beverly. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to talk to you a little bit about George Washington's design innovation. It's been a pleasure over the last 3 years here at Mount Vernon to work with Greg and Beverly and the Harden team. It's certainly the licensed products is something I did not learn about in graduate school, so it's been interesting to branch out into that and look at things that aren't 200 years old, things that are going into the modern home. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a project that we've been working on and that we actually finished up last year, George Washington's new room, because I felt that best encapsulated George Washington's design innovation, as it's a space that he worked on for over 25 years of his life. So as Washington worked on this room for 25 years between 1774 and his death in 1779. We've done a lot of restoration in the past 3 years. So here you see two different images of what we call the new room. The one on the left is the new room in 1982, and the one on the right is the new room as reopened in 2014. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit today about two separate topics, but they work together quite a bit. The first is how George Washington put together the space. The second is how we have done the research over the previous few years to really restore that space, and it's a product of generations of research. As technologies improve, as our abilities to get the proper materials also improve, we're able to refine the work that's been done by previous generations. Unfortunately, 200 years ago, there were no cameras. So we're not able we don't have a complete snapshot of everything that went on in these spaces, but we have worked to research and to cull Washington's documentary references and scientific references in some of what you'll see to really put that together and restore the spaces in the mansion to the way that Washington would have seen them in the last year of his life in 1799. That's the standard we hold ourselves to. So before I tell you about the new room, and it's sort of an enigmatic phrase that I will explain in just one second, I want to tell you a little bit about the evolution of the mansion, because that'll tell you how it got here. So as you all know, George Washington, Mount Vernon was originally built by George Washington's father in 1735. It was a much smaller house, even smaller than the one that you see up there, only 1 story in height. Washington first expanded it between 1757 and 1759. Washington in 1757 was a young member of the gentry class, not the top of the gentry class, but a young member of sort of the lower gentry, and he really wanted to show off with his home and his furnishings. So he expanded the house to a full 2 stories in height, and basically that's what you see on the top between 1757 and 1759. In 1759, George Washington marries Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children from the eastern part of Virginia, and she moves here and brings those children here. And this is the house that they live in for the next 20 years. In 1774, Washington decides that there's not quite enough space in the home, and he's doing lots of entertaining. The family has expanded over the years, and he is also hosting lots of folks here at Mount Vernon, and Washington decides to expand the house and make it a little bit larger. So first he adds a wing to the south. Basically, it's from the chimney that you see there to the right. On the bottom floor, there is what the George Washington study, and on the top floor is the Washington bedchamber, or Mrs. Washington's chamber. To the north, he wants to add a symmetrical wing. As you know, in the 18th century, symmetry is everything. So to the north, he adds from the chimney over here to the left. But what to do with that space? He really was exploring what he wanted to do in figuring that out. So in 1774, Washington decided that he wanted to add a saloon in the British sense of the word, not the Wild West sense. Washington wanted to add a saloon, and a saloon in the 18th century England was a multi-purpose space. It was really a showplace room. That's what he wanted to add. So he wanted to put this space here is a full 2 stories in height, and we know that in 1774 Washington did plan it as a saloon because he had the intents to install the full Palladian window that you see here, which goes that full height. The average Virginian's home in the 18th century would have fit easily in this space. The only comparable spaces in 18th century Virginia are in places like the governor's palace, the supper room there, or in courthouses and in churches. This would have been an imposing space for people to see. The concept of the design of this room is one that comes from England. It's called a double cube room. Inigo Jones introduces it to England at Wilton House in the 1630s. It has amazing proportions. Basically, it's 2 cubes right next to each other. And the 2 major elements that are in these spaces are a large window. Eventually in England, they're almost all Palladian windows, or Venetian windows as they would have called them in the period, just like this one, and a large mantelpiece flank on the other side. So these are the 2 opposite sides of the room. Now, Washington left for as you know, Washington in the 1770s was a very busy man. In 1776, he is away during the Revolution, and he writes back to his farm manager, Lund Washington, and asks him to begin erecting the North Wing. But when Washington returns, there is very little to that space. Basically, it's only framed out, it's roofed, and some of the framing elements are actually rotting out. So that was Washington in the 1770s and what he was thinking about. But when he comes back after the Revolution, Washington is a very different man, and that's why I have this painting up. This is a painting done by John Trumbull. It is Washington resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. When Washington resigned his commission, it was basically a momentous event in the history of the world. Here was this grand military leader who had fought and freed his people from the tyranny of Great Britain, and he has decided to go back to his farm and turn control back over to the civilian authorities, which is what he's doing in this image. Washington at that point is almost immediately identified as what's called an American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was an ancient Roman general who fought to free the Roman Republic. After he finished that battle, he went back to his own home and continued to farm. So people in the 18th century who were educated in the classics really understood that comparison, and they compared George Washington to that. So Washington gets back to Mount Vernon. The room is empty, basically just framed out. And on his way down to Annapolis from Newburgh, New York, he stops by Philadelphia and meets a man by the name of Samuel Vaughn. Vaughn is a wealthy British merchant who has come over here after the signing of the Treaty of Paris to see what this new American experiment is about. The thing about Vaughn is he was also an amateur architect and landscape designer. George Washington talked to him while in Philadelphia about a couple of projects he was working on, including the new room. And at that point, Washington was looking for a marble mantelpiece to install in the new room. Vaughn knew he had just the mantel. It was in his own home in Wanstead, which is a little place outside of London. He had it deinstalled, shipped over in 11 crates, and it arrived here at Mount Vernon in 1784. And Vaughn really keyed into that image of Washington as the American Cincinnatus. Here I've blown up an image of the central panel that you see there of the bucolic farming scene. He really was thinking about that. That's what was on his mind, the American Cincinnatus ideal. So this arrives here, and Washington sees the 11 crates. They haven't been unpacked yet, and he writes to Vaughn this wonderful thank you note, and he says, "Thank you for sending the mantelpiece, but it's far too grand for my Republican style of living." Well, we know it must not have been, because Washington kept it here and had it installed in the mansion. The next year, 1785, after the mantel was installed, Washington hired a plaster artist from Baltimore by the name of John Rollins. John Rollins had trained in London in the art of basically creating fashionable composition work, which is a plaster composition that's molded, that's actually molded and then applied to the ceilings. This was a new thing in the 18th century, in the neoclassical era. A new technique that came in under neoclassicism that was academically correct and fueled by archaeology that's going on in ancient Greece and Rome. The brothers Adam in England are major proponents of the neoclassical taste. So Washington works with Rollins to customize what Vaughn has already given him, customize Vaughn's idea to Washington's own particular circumstances. And what he does is create this wonderful plaster ceiling, one of the most important ceilings in America, and he takes those motifs that really relate to Washington as a farmer. So you see a wheat sheave and a sickle up there, you see a shovel and a pick here, really talking about Washington in this refined space as a farmer and as the American Cincinnatus. And here you can see how all of those scenes work together, this from the marble mantel, and then the wheat sheave there, and the hammer and the pick. But that's as far, basically, as Washington got in the 1780s. Once again, he's called in 1787 to serve his country. He goes to Philadelphia and presides over the Constitutional Convention. And then, not long after that, in 1789, he's unanimously elected President of the United States. So we're not sure what happened in this room between 1789 and 1797 when Washington came back. There are a couple of letters. It seems like Washington is using the space for storage, but we know he didn't furnish the space. That doesn't happen until after the presidency. I want to talk a little bit about how we do restoration projects because it seems to be it's really fun. Science is involved in it, and it's something that very few people understand in the nitty-gritty of it outside of our community. But first, I have this strange slide that looks sort of like a layer cake, and this is a microscopic. This is what we call paint analysis, which is conducted. Basically, small fragments of paint are taken from woodwork, and it's put under a microscope and magnified to a couple of hundred times its size, and then photographs are taken, and we can determine the layers of paint as they would have occurred in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So here down at number 1, you can see the first paint layer on some of those architectural elements in the house, which is this wonderful green, what they call verdigris, which is the oxidation of copper that creates that wonderful green color. And then a second generation that's a little bit lighter. Third generation is this, what they called chrome yellow that was put in by Washington's nephew Bushrod when he inherited the property, all the way down to the replication paints that we did in 1982. Through carefully analyzing the chemical composition, we're able to figure out what these paints look like and replicate them in a hand-ground way as they would have been done in the 18th century. So that's what we did here. I always love these because they look like sort of modern art. So our paint analyst actually blows these up and creates artwork out of them as well as doing the historic work. We also had fragments of wallpaper because we knew there was a lot of wallpaper in the house. These were found in the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, and these are fragments of the border paper that you see here. 2 individual ones. We had reproduced that first in the 1950s under Nancy McClellan, the famous interior designer and sort of decorative arts historian. That's what she did. She sort of figured out what the bottom half of that would have looked like based on other comparables. But as part of this process, we reinvestigated it to see if we could find actual documentary evidence of what the bottom half of this wallpaper looked like. And luckily, there is a museum of wallpaper and paint in Paris, and they had the archives of Jacques Mart, who was an 18th century paper stainer. He did a lot of work for Louis XVI, got in trouble during the French Revolution. But you can see his pattern there on the right, and you can see what the bottom of that pattern looked like. So for the first time since 1797, we were able to replicate what Washington had. And we worked with the company Adelphi Papers out of New York. They're a fantastic company, and they hand-blocked this wallpaper for us. But what was sort of the field of those walls? It wasn't painted. Because paint in the 18th century, it was hard to get a very consistent surface. Instead, Washington chose to use wallpaper in the room in a brilliant field color called Verniture. And I apologize for the darkness of this paper. We were taking it while work was being done. But you can see the wallpaper that has been painted, and it's now waiting to go up onto the walls. And wallpaper in the 18th century came in rolls, but each of the rolls was sheets of paper that were glued together. So you can't see the seams, but once you get into the room, you will be able to see them. But the seams about here and here all the way up, glued together, then painted in the factory in France, shipped over to America, and they would have been installed in sort of irregular patterns on the walls so that you don't have a checkerboard pattern going on in there. So that's the field paper that Washington had as the background. In 1797, Washington bought what was really the most fashionable at the time. He's always looking for what is the most fashionable. And at that point in America, Philadelphia was the center of all activity. Philadelphia was the national capital before it moved to D.C. Philadelphia was the most prosperous city, and they had a team of cabinet makers there who really were doing the best work in America. One of them, a Scotsman named John Aiken, Washington seemed to be particularly fond of. Aiken made this sideboard here that you see for the new room. Washington ordered 2 of these, and it's important to point out that in this space you have there were 2 sideboards because occasionally the room would have been used for dining in addition to using it as a grand entertaining space. Tables could have been brought in and it would have been used for dining. So the linens and silver and other things could have been locked up in this, a real indication that they did use it for dining. Also bought 24 chairs. These are this is actually a pattern that's modified from 2 separate 18th century pattern books, Hepplewhite and Sheraton, and Aiken mixed both of them. We think he had a silk damask upholstery on these, and we have them displayed in the mansion today in 2 separate ways. We'll sometimes have them with the show covers off, but a lot of times in the 18th century they would have just kept the slip covers on them to prevent light damage because these textiles were so incredibly valuable in the 18th century. Washington had 24 of these. We don't have quite as many in the room because we have to accommodate the tour path today. One of the things we were really concerned about in this particular project is how Washington would have lighted the room. That was important to him, and we wanted to carefully think about that as we worked through the project. And there were indications to us as to what that was, how he did it. So some of the greatest objects in the collection are this pair of mirrors and brackets, is what they were called in the 18th century. Mirrors, brackets, and lusters. And these hung in the new room. They've hung in the new room since 1932. But I've always looked at them and sort of thought something's not quite right. And it turns out I was right. And so this is a print from the 19th century that depicts these mirrors and brackets. And you can see where the arms are bent up here. They should have folded down gracefully. And where you have this dinky little candlestick here, on the other side, you would have had 2 lusters with 2 lights, and Washington always refers to them as such. So far as I know, this is a fairly unique American invention. Sometimes in Britain, you would get lusters attached to mirrors, but I've never seen a mirror and bracket where you could remove the luster and take it out into the room. It was very economical. And one of the finest carvers in 18th century America, James Reynolds, actually carved these in Philadelphia. There were a set of 4 of them that Washington used during the presidency. So these are iron wires that are bent up that have formed that, and they've hung that way since at least since we got them. So as part of this project, I worked with a conservator in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I asked him to return them to that way. And I asked him to please not tell me when he was going to do that because I was very nervous that these were going to break. But he carefully bent them back, and here you can see what it looks like on the right. That graceful swag with the drop, and this looks like, and this is basically, you've got 2 bananas hanging off the sides here. But we've also restored the lusters to this, with the lusters with 2 lights, which Washington was very particular about. And you can see it fills the whole of the oval in the back. It's really graceful. Now, as part of modern museum techniques, we're able to do things that they weren't able to in the 18th century. So we were really concerned about the weight of that luster sitting on that piece of wood. It's a very thin piece of wood. So we have a mechanism that goes all along the back of the mirror and bracket that screws into the wall, and then there's a small little plate that pokes out, and it holds the bottom of the luster, and you can just barely see it there. And so we're able to not put any pressure on the 18th century wood. More light in the room. Washington was interested in changes in technology. Sustainability is part of that. And one of the new things that occurred in Washington's lifetime was a switch in the way rooms were lighted. In the 1780s, a man by the last name of Argand came up with a new lighting device that burned whale oil, and as Washington wrote, it burned with the light of 10 candles. So each one of these would have put out quite a bit of light for the 18th century. We had two of these original argan lamps that were installed in the mansion. They were installed over top of the mantelpiece, but we knew from Washington's probate inventory that there were originally 4 of them. And you could also read that probate inventory, which is an inventory of his estate taken after his death, that they were hanging on either side of the mirrors, and they had a very practical reason for that. They wanted to reflect out as much light as they possibly could. So for the first time since Washington's death, we have put them on either side of the mirrors, and you can see, I really wish we could actually put whale oil and see what it looked like, but it reflects light out into the room. Washington wasn't afraid of mixing styles. In the 1760s, Washington purchased these torchères, very Rococo, very fashionable, would have been very fashionable at the time. But Washington, they basically would have held candelabra on top of them and could have been used in the room. They are in this very neoclassical space at the end of Washington's lifetime. So he was a fan of mixing styles a little bit. One of the big conundrums that really hit us with the space was what to do about curtains in the room. And when I first got here to Mount Vernon, I was sort of wandering around looking for things and just getting my bearings of the space. And I was up on the 3rd floor of the mansion in one of the storage rooms, and I found these cornice boards, or what sometimes are called pelmets. And I looked at them and I said, the composition ornament on these is very similar to what's in the new room. And I was told at the time, no, they're nothing. So basically, I took these and found out that they'd been with Mount Vernon since 1860, when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association took over, which meant they and had been transferred from the Washington family. So there was a very high likelihood that they were Washington objects. So we did a lot of testing on these. First, we x-rayed them to find out what the nails look like. Nail technology changes in the 1790s, so we know these have hand-wrought nails, which that was the dying in the 1790s is the last time hand-wrought nails are really used here in major metropolitan areas. We also found that there were 11 layers of paint, so these things had been here for a really long time. As it turns out, they are the original cornice boards for the 2 smaller windows in the new room. And we had them meticulously looked at, but then we reconstructed them. So one of our furniture folks in Williamsburg actually made the reproductions for us, and this is the paint as it would have looked in the 18th century. But this is sort of an interesting conundrum, because you'll see in this next slide that there's something a little bit off about the way that it fits into the room. The cornice boards are too small. So did some research into that and found out that George Washington had written to his farm manager in 1796, and he asked him for measurements of everything in the house because Washington was getting ready to bring things back from Philadelphia, and so he was ordering things based on these measurements. So the farm manager comes and measures the windows, and from out to out on the architraves, he says that they're 3 feet 8 inches wide. Well, the cornice boards that Washington brought back are exactly 3 feet 8 inches wide. And Washington gets here, it's actually 3 feet 9.5 inches wide. Washington's here in basically the country. So what does he do? He's bought these new curtains. He has to sort of figure out how to work with them, and that's the way we've interpreted it. So this is one of the very few instances in a historic house where you can sort of see Washington's design errors, design mistakes. And I think that's a really fun concept to think about. One thing that would lessen that issue were if the wallpaper border didn't go all the way around, you wouldn't notice it as much. But the few places we've actually found that wallpaper border were around those windows. So we wanted people to be able to see that. Artwork. Washington brings back most of this artwork that hangs in the space from the presidency. Some of it is artwork that is gifts to either him or Martha. Some of it is material that he has purchased. Almost everything hangs symmetrically in the house, where everything has a pair. So interestingly, in the new room, the one pair is this print of Louis XVI in this wonderful elaborate frame, and this painting by John Trumbull of George Washington. They hang across the room from each other. Washington received this print in 1791 as a gift from the French minister to the United States at the time. 1791, the French Revolution is just getting ready to take off. And you see on this frame, it's a very elaborate frame. You see George Washington's coat of arms at the bottom, and at the top are Louis XVI. So 1793, Louis XVI is deposed. By 1797, he has long since lost his head when Washington installs this in the new room. It's interesting as a comparison between two different styles of leaders, but Washington had a very clear affection as well for Louis XVI, because you have to remember that the French were so instrumental in supplying the necessary resources for the Americans during the American Revolution, and with the Army and with the Navy as well. And if it hadn't been for the French Navy, we wouldn't have won the Revolution. So interesting to think about that. The painting to the right is by John Trumbull. John Trumbull was one of Washington's aides-de-camp during the American Revolution. He ends up going to England and studying under Benjamin West, another American expatriate, comes back here to America and wants to start painting scenes from the American Revolution. He goes back to his general and asks him for several sittings, and as part of that, in 1790, he sends to Martha Washington a gift of this painting. This is a replica of it. The original is at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. But this is George Washington as the victorious general in 1781 after the Battle of Yorktown. And the scene that you see in the background is a scene at Verplank's Point in New York, when basically the American troops went up from all the way up to New York from Yorktown, and then the French troops came in later. And this is the French and the American troops meeting for the first time after that victory. So Washington very much is the victorious general. This is one of my very favorite paintings of George Washington. There wasn't the system of patronizing artists here in America that there was in Great Britain or in France. So Washington really worked to try to rectify that. When John Trumbull decided to make his print series of the American Revolution, Washington was the very first subscriber. He subscribed to 5 sets of each of these prints: the death of General Montgomery and the Battle of Bunker's Hill. And Washington hung 2 of each of these in that space. One was an artist proof, and the other was a final version. Washington was also an early collector of American landscape art. These are 2 paintings by William Winstanley, both of the North River. Washington viewed waterways as really the highway of commerce to the west, and he really saw America as the granary to the world, and he wanted to use the waterways to bring product out to the east and then sell it on the East Coast and to other countries. So Washington was always interested in waterways. These 2 fantastic scenes Washington purchased in 1793 hung in the presidential residence. They're actually in their original frames from the 1790s, which is a very rare thing. And these 2 are 2 of my favorites. These are by another British artist who came over here to America by the name of George Beck. The one on the left is a scene of both are the Potomac River. This is Great Falls of the Potomac, and to the right is the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah Rivers. And so here you can see how they hang in the space. The Potomac ones are over on the river side of the house, and there you can see the slip covers as well. And one last slide. This space would have been, as I said, the most important in the house by the end of Washington's life. Washington's guests would have experienced it. First, they would have been received in the central passage, then taken through the west parlor, which is this one-story room, and then they would have walked through that door and seen this grand expanse in front of them. It must have been a tremendous experience for Americans in that time period who had never really seen anything like this. But I always have to say that the new room is the grandest and most exceptional, but it shows Washington over the course of 3 decades of his life. And after Washington passed away in December of 1799, he laid in repose for 3 days, really with the accomplishments of his life surrounding him in that space before he's taken down to the family tomb. And this space really embodies George Washington in a way that that very few other spaces do. With that, thank you so much, and we will be doing tours in just a minute. Oh, questions? Any questions? First. Yes, sir.
Is there any record of Jefferson advising Washington on architectural and design?
There's no record of Jefferson advising Washington on that. The things that Washington and Jefferson correspond about are crops. So they didn't talk, and it's Jefferson has a very different style.
I want to say that Jefferson never, because Jefferson was also Republican.
Yeah, exactly. By this point, they weren't very friendly. Any other questions? Thank you so much.